Down to Earth, Nature's Role in American History by Ted Steinberg. Chapter 10. Death of the Organic City. Before 1880, it was not the least bit unusual to walk out into the streets of Atlanta and find cows. In 1881, however, the city's political leaders decided that bovines were no longer welcome. The cows could come home, as the saying goes, but not to the streets of Atlanta, not after the city council passed a law making it illegal for cattle to roam the town. Apparently, a large number of working people who depended on the animals as a source of milk and meat objected to the ordinance. A man named J.D. Garrison denounced the law as little more than a thinly veiled attempt at class warfare. "I speak the feelings of every man when I say this is the dictation front yard of the rich man and the sustenance of the poor family." The large animals that once wandered the streets of urban America are, of course, long gone. Finding out how and why they disappeared means taking a journey back to the 19th century, to the Progressive Era, when cities across the nation underwent a major cleanup. While conservationists put the countryside in order, another group of reformers trained their sights on urban areas. In 1869, only 9 cities had populations exceeding 100,000. In 1890, 28 had reached that mark. A third of all Americans now lived in such places: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston, and Baltimore, in that order, were the nation's largest population centers, filled with immigrants who lived in such places: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston, and Baltimore, in that order, were the nation's largest population centers, filled with immigrants who worked producing apparel, forging steel, and packing meat. Crammed with people in factories, in addition to the pigs, horses, mules, cattle, and goats used for food and transport, the city emerged by the late 19th century as a dark and filthy place. Muckraker Upton Sinclair, in his novel The Jungle, captured the enormity of the problem, describing the strange, pungent odor people smelled as they approached Chicago stockyards, a stench you could literally taste, and the chimneys belching out smoke that was thick, oily, and black as night. Of a clean and healthful environment, not genetic predisposition, as formerly been believed, could defend against ignorance and criminality. Taking their cue from the British, they formed settlement houses, most famously Hull House, established by Adams in Chicago in 1889, the model for some 400 such community institutions nationwide. The settlement houses engaged in a host of efforts to improve the lives of slum dwellers, setting up kindergartens and sponsoring everything from health clinics to music studios to playgrounds. In 1894, Adams herself, in an effort to lower the mortality rate in one ward, led a group of immigrant women from Hull House on a nightly inspection designed to check up on the work of the city's garbage collectors. As important as the sanitary reforms were, especially the improved water and sewer systems that led to a decline in disease, they came at a cost. All dirt is not equally bad. Cleaner cities are not necessarily better for everyone. Indeed, there were some virtues to the filth. Life in the organic city, a place swarming with pigs and horses and stampeded in mountains of manure, was dirty, but it also had a certain social and environmental logic. Today, we rarely associate big animals with urban areas, with the possible exception of the horse and buggy tour. In the 19th century, however, it would be impossible to imagine such places without the creatures that roamed the streets, not to mention the stinking piles of excrement they left behind. In these days, before municipal trash collection, working class women fed their families with pigs that fattened on city garbage. Horses carried people and goods, hauled pumps to help out the fires, and even produced power for manufacturing such things as bricks and lumber. Horse manure, meanwhile, did not go to waste. It streamed into the surrounding vegetable farms, where it bolstered soil fertility. Even a good deal of human waste, which piled up in the privies and cesspools in the days before sanitary sewers, found its way to the rural hinterlands. City dwellers and their animals were largely integrated into a regional soil cycle, supplying it with the nutrients for growing food that was then tucked back into the town, trucked with vegetables and hay flowing one way and waste the other. In the 19th century, reformers bent on sanitation put an end to this city in its down-to-earth form. They drove the pigs out, forcing the working class to rely more on the cash economy for food, and substituted municipal garbage collectors for the hogs. They replaced horses with electric streetcars, ending the city's role as a manure factory and stimulating nearby vegetable farmers to turn to artificial fertilizers. They built sewage systems that carried waste off into lakes, rivers, and harbors, eliminating the privies and the quote-unquote night soil men who had delivered the excrement to the countryside, distancing urbanities from the land they drove out, from the land they had once helped to enrich. Overall, public health improved, but the poor were left to fend for themselves, and the wage economy as the urban commons, akin to the open range in the South and West, vanished. Public health indeed had its virtues, but it also had some important social and ecological trade-offs. Walking sewers. When Europeans visualized America in the 19th century, they thought of Native Americans, a strange new group of people unknown on their continent. But when they pictured American cities, it was not Indians and buffaloes, but pigs that came to mind. No animal loomed larger in. I have not yet found a city, country, or town where I have not seen these lovable animals wandering about peacefully in huge herds, wrote old Munch Rader, a Norwegian lawyer, on a visit to America in 1847. Swine, he observed, kept the city streets clean by, quote, eating up all kinds of refuse, and then, when these walking sewers are properly filled up, they are butchered and provide a real treat for the dinner table. Azu, hey, I don't like your pachi-pachi's feet. Go, gonza, mada. Arigato. Working class women who depended on pigs to supply food for the table allowed them to scavenge the urban commons for garbage, while rural hogs fed on the forest's acorns. City pigs fed on the waste people threw away, converting it into protein for the poor people. But a food source to some provided a nuisance to others. So many pigs wandered the street of Little Rock, Arkansas at mid-century that, according to one newspaper report, they had come, quote, to dispute the sidewalks with other persons, unquote. These creatures were not the sedate porkers one encounters today at the zoo. They were wild animals that injured and occasionally killed children, a nasty and brutish lot. The urban pigs copulated in public and had the annoying habit of defecating on people. Habit of defecating on people. The authorities in New York City had sought to ban swine from the streets as early as 1810s, but public outcry led to the prohibition's repeal. In 1818, however, a grand jury indicted 2 men for the misdemeanor of, quote, keeping and permitting to run hogs at large in the city of New York, unquote. The first of the accused was convicted after failing to mount a defense of his actions and forced to pay a small fee. The second man, a butcher named Christian Harriet, decided to fight the charge. The dandies who are too delicate to endure the sight or even the idea of so odious a creature might welcome a conviction, Harriet's lawyers argued. But many poor families might experience far different sense for a portion of that subsistence of which a conviction in this case would deprive them. Closing the urban commons, in other words, would take the food out of the mouths of the poor. It is said that if we restrain swine from running the streets, we shall injure the poor, Mayor Cadwallader Colden observed. Why, gentlemen, must we feed the poor at the expense of human flesh? He asked. Eliminate the commons, and the poor would be forced to find jobs to pay for food, instead of taking their meals at the expense of the city's more refined residents. As for the fact that swine played a useful part in cleaning up the city's streets, Colden intoned, I think our corporation will not employ brutal agency for the object when men can be got to do it. Will not employ brutal agency for the object when men can be got to do it. In the end, Harriet was convicted. As of 1819, setting pigs free became a crime. But that did not deter people. In 1821, city authorities went to war against the pigs, taking many into custody as Irish and black women banded together to defend the animals. Other significant pig-related conflicts erupted in 1825, 1826, 1830, and 1832. Pigs played a central role in the lives of the poor, who were willing to do what they could to save them. In 1849, however, the urban commons experienced a fatal blow. Cholera broke out in New York, and health officials linked the outbreak to the city's filthy conditions. No animal symbolized dirt more clearly than the pig. Swine out of cellars and garrets, banishing them uptown. By 1860, the area below 86th Street had been secured as a pig-free zone, but in the uptown wards, the pigs still ruled. So many hogs roamed the area around 125th Street in Harlem at mid-century that the area came to be known as Pig's Alley. City authorities in New York and other urban areas, meanwhile, continued to tolerate pigsties as late as the 1870s, with some tenement residents even boarding them in their rooms, demonstrating the importance the poor attached to the animal. By the late decades of the 19th century, the urban commons drew to a close, not just in New York, but in cities throughout America. Mayor Colden's wish for a pig-free city, one where women could walk the streets, quote, without encountering the most disgusting spectacles of these animals indulging the propensities of nature, unquote, seemed well within reach. The urban pig was ultimately exiled to the farmland, where to this day it perpetuates the division between the country and the city. City as manure factory. Like the pig, the horse also played an important, if somewhat hidden role in our urban ecology, one overshadowed by its more obvious place at the heart of economic life. No animal, with the possible exception of the mule, important only in the South, did more to serve the transportation needs of urban areas. In the early days of cities, horse-drawn buses, omnibuses, operated on cobblestone streets at speeds hardly faster than a walking pace. In the period just before the Civil War, however, the horse car spread to cities across the nation, faster and more efficient than older omnibuses. Teams of horses hitched to passenger cars transported people and goods up and down iron tracks. By 1890, more than 32 million passengers climbed aboard New York's horse car lines. The number of urban horses nearly doubled to a little under 3 million over the course of the last third of the 19th century. The adoption of the horse car contributed to the rise, as did the expansion of railroad transportation. As trains shipped more goods from point to point, horses were needed to haul the freight from terminals to the ultimate destination. The horse's importance to urban life was made amply apparent by fire equipment. The horses struck down by a flu-like disease were either dead or ill and thus unable to answer the call for help. The fire charred over 700 buildings as a result. Equines in other cities ultimately felt the effect of the outbreak. In Detroit, delivery companies made do with hand carts, which killed somewhere on the order of 5% of all urban horses in the Northeast and Canada. Horses generated power for transportation and manufacturing too, but they also produced staggering amounts of manure, somewhere between 15 and 30 pounds per animal every day. In Milwaukee, this translated into 133 tons of horse droppings. In 1900, one health officer in Rochester, New York, apparently with nothing better to do, calculated the city's 15,000 horses of horse droppings. In 1900, one health officer in Rochester, New York, apparently with nothing better to do, calculated the city's 15,000 horses contributed enough dung each year to completely cover an acre to a height of 175 feet. Worse still, the stinking piles bred countless numbers of flies, which harbored disease, including typhoid fever. Then there was the dust to contend with. Horse turds dried up in the heat only to be pulverized by the creatures themselves as their hoofs made contact with the pavement. Ground horse excrement, with the 19th century equivalent of auto pollution, and was just as irritating to people's respiratory systems. The problems created by horse dung and used it to fertilize their hay and vegetable crops. The hay then went to feed the urban horse population, and the vegetables to enhance the dinner tables of the city's better off residents. As a truck farmer from New Jersey explained, quote, "In our large commercial and manufacturing cities where wealth was concentrated, and where abound families who live regardless of expenditures, fabulous prices are freely paid for vegetables and fruits to please the palate or adorn the table. By the mid-19th century, a reciprocal system with manure passing one way and vegetables and hay the other had grown up in New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston. New Yorkers perfected the system. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 propelled the city's rise to commercial dominance and spurred farmers near the waterway to give up grain production in favor of potatoes, cucumbers, cabbages, onions, and sweet corn, all of which commanded good prices in the city's market. In 1879, Brooklyn and Queens, New York, now the very essence of urbanity, even led the nation in market gardening. Brooklyn was described by one source as an quote-unquote immense garden serving the quote vast and increasing demand of the city of New York for vegetables and fruits of a perishable nature, unquote. The soil in Brooklyn and Queens is shallow, limiting the ability of roots to spread, and it is not particularly adapted to storing moisture. Normally, a farmer would need to keep plenty of hay on hand to feed livestock, limiting the ability of roots to spread, and it is not particularly adapted to storing moisture. Normally, a farmer would need to keep plenty of hay on hand to feed livestock that produce the soil fortifying manure. But with Manhattan dairies and stables located nearby, it made economic sense for farmers to sell their hay and purchase horse manure in return. Manure from all over the New York City area formed the ecological lifeblood of Brooklyn and Queens farming. Brooklynites, one newspaper noted, quote, are no doubt glad to get rid of their filth, and the Board of Health will compel them to do so. But our farmers are glad to obtain means with which to enrich their lands and pay a fair price for such materials, unquote. Horse manure was so on the farm at the time of my decease, unquote. This ingenious early effort at recycling, however, proved short-lived. By the end of the 19th century, improvements in refrigeration and railroad transportation allowed farms in the South and California to outcompete Brooklyn and Queens for New York City's booming vegetable and food trade. Meanwhile, in the late 1880s, the advent of electrified streetcars drove the horse and the manure out of the cities all across the nation. In 1912, a traffic count revealed for the first time more cars than horses in New York. By the following year, so little evidence remained of the manure-based truck farms that the Brooklyn Botanic Garden found itself weighing the educational potential of putting vegetables on exhibit. It was a museum sense that, quote, innumerable children and young people had never seen beans and peas growing on the plants that produced them, unquote. Vegetables and horse manure now joined pigs on distant farms, further reinforcing division between urban and rural life and contributing to the illusion of the city as somehow existing outside of nature. Flush and forget. Before the rise of the flush and forget mentality, human waste actually served a purpose in life. But to understand its role, we must put aside all squeamishness and, as it were, follow the shit. Generally speaking, mid-19th century city dwellers relieved themselves in outhouses or follow the shit. Generally speaking, mid-19th century city dwellers relieved themselves in outhouses or privies. From that point, the excrement found its way into privy vaults and cesspools, which were little more than holes in the ground. Some waste seeped into the surrounding soil. Some of it invariably drained into the streets when the vaults backed up or overflowed, and some fell to the so-called necessary tubman, a necessary being another name for a privy, to deal with. The tubman, a job often filled by African Americans, used buckets, casks, and ultimately carts to haul away the night soil, referred to as such because the men did their dirty work after people had gone to sleep. By rivers and lakes, but a good deal of it, at least by the late 19th century, when reliable figures are available, journeyed in good biblical fashion back onto the earth. In 1880, nearly half of the more than 200 U.S. cities surveyed deposited night soil on the land or sold it to dealers who made it into fertilizer. As late as 1912, Tubman in Baltimore, still without a sewer system, cleaned out roughly 70,000 privy vaults and cesspools, barges, and shipped the waste to the outskirts of town, where it was sold in 1,000-gallon quantities to farmers. They used it to grow tomatoes, cabbage, and other vegetables for urban consumption. Of course, the vast majority of human excrement produced in cities did not resurface on farms. But that said, a viable system for recycling human waste existed in 19th century America. What forces combined to cause its downfall? How did urban populations across the nation find themselves cut off from the soil and bereft of the role they once played in maintaining it? The story begins with water. And in the early 19th century, most urbanites depended on cisterns and wells, those who could afford to purchase water from petty proprietors who went from door to door. As urban populations surged and leaking privies contaminated the underground supply, however, the demand for fresh water rose. In response, cities established public water systems. Philadelphia led the way, and New York, Boston, and Detroit and Cincinnati soon fell into 1880. Nearly 600 public water systems were in use across the country, complex networks that often brought water from lakes, at times miles and miles away, to serve the needs of the urban areas. In 1842, New York, for instance, opened its Croton Aqueduct, which transported water over 40 miles from Westchester County. The city would eventually draw on the Catskill watershed some 100 miles north. In 1848, Boston tapped Lake Cochituat. I don't know how to say that. Lake Cochituat. I should have practiced my New England words. All right. 50 miles to the west. And early the following century went even further afield to dam the waters of the Nashua River to create the Wachusett Reservoir. The water brought life to the city, but death to parts of the rural towns of West Boylston and Clinton, Massachusetts, which were inundated. Its residents sent packing to support population growth in a faraway urban land. Meanwhile, clear across the continent, Los Angeles was concocting its own imperial plan for draining off the natural wealth of the countryside. In 1906, the city obtained the necessary rights of way from the federal government to build a 235-mile aqueduct that would bring water from the Owens River directly into the metropolis. In perfecting their plan, city most conservationist, President Theodore Roosevelt, quote, "It is 100 or 1,000-fold more important to the state and more valuable to the people as a whole," he remarked, "if this water is used by the city than if used by the people of the Owens Valley. As supply increased, demand boomed in cities across the nation, especially as the rich installed water closets, the forerunner of the modern toilet. A mere 7 years after completion of the Cochituat Aqueduct in 1848, some 18,000 Boston households had water connections. Further west, Cleveland commandeered Lake Erie in 1856. 1 year later, Clevelanders used 8 gallons of water per person. Each day. In 1872, they were using 55. There was only one problem. The cesspools and privies could not handle all the waste, although an alternative existed in the earth closet, a device consisting of a seat placed over a container of dirt, which, quote unquote, flushed dirt over the excrement and thereby produced fertilizer. Waste removal by water eventually ruled the day. Persuaded by the convenience of water, residents in some cities lobbied their governments to allow them to hook their drains up directly to existing sewers. But these sewers were designed with a grade steep only enough to handle free-flowing rainwater. and broke down when used to transport gluttonous torrents of human waste. As sewers backed up and cesspools oozed, cities across the nation began to drown in their own filth. To deal with the problem, engineers, city officials, and sanitary experts rallied around the idea of more underground plumbing. Eventually, thousands of miles of sewer pipe were laid as human waste went flushing into rivers, lakes, and harbors. Common wisdom at the time held that running water purified itself, which is true as long as the amount of waste does not exceed the ability of bacteria in the water to break it down into harmless substances. Unaware of the fine points involved in wastewater disposal, but attracted to its convenience, major cities built nearly 25,000 miles of sewer lines by 1909. But whereas water supplies tended to be paid for out of public monies, sewers went in only at the request of property owners, who were assessed accordingly. In other words, in 1857, New York City had installed just 138 miles of sewers along its 500 miles of paved streets, circumnavigating the city's poorest sections. One New York landlord, desperate to hold down his expenses, protested having to pay a sewer assessment. Sewers, he remarked, are an unhealthy arrangement and should be avoided at all times if possible. Others, however, seemed less driven by mercenary motives than by practicality in opposing the transformation of the underground into a huge wastewater superhighway. In 1853, one farmer from Ulster County, situated along the Hudson River, lamented that New York City was annually wasting enough human excrement to grow 180 million pounds of wheat. Engineer and sewer expert George Waring Jr. believed New Yorkers were flushing away some $5 million worth of valuable fertilizer each year. Prominent New Yorker and journalist Horace Greeley, meanwhile, labeled the city's wasteful practice an quote-unquote inexplicable stupidity, and observed that ancient societies had been undermined by, quote, the exhaustion of the soil through the loss of such manures in their capitals. It was ridiculous, he wrote in 1871, to pay for guano when New York actually poisons its own atmosphere and adjacent waters with excrements which science and capital might combine to utilize at less than half the cost. Although a number of efforts were made beginning in the late 19th century to use urban sewage on farms, especially in the West, a region desperate for water, no matter what its source. U.S. cities had by the 1920s severed the connection between human waste and the soil. Seduced by the convenience of water, urban areas packed with people and water closets unwittingly launched one of the largest aquatic experiments in the nation's history. In 1933, the western end of Lake Erie, one observer remarked, looked as if it were coated with green paint. The paint was algae, and algae bloom, to be more precise. Algae are microscopic plants, normally present in lakes. In Lake Erie's healthier days, algae existed in sparse numbers, in part because the lake's limited supply of phosphorus kept them from flourishing. But when the human waste contains large amounts of phosphorus, and with city dwellers flushing away in their water closets, more of it wound up lake-bound, where it made the algae thrive. Eventually, the algae died, and the green slime sank to the bottom, where bacteria set to work decomposing it, using lots of oxygen to carry out the job. Beginning in the late 19th century, the oxygen decline, in conjunction with overfishing, changed the species makeup of Lake Erie and the rest of the Great Lakes. Whitefish, herring, trout, and sturgeon, the major commercial fish, depend on clear, oxygen-rich water. With the decline in lake conditions, however, species more adapted to the new aquatic environment, such as yellow perch, catfish, and pickerel, replaced them. Urban sewage had an even more devastating effect on fish in the lower part of the Delaware River. As late as 1890s, Delaware's watershed's shad fishery was the nation's largest, supplying urbanites as far away as Cleveland, Chicago, and areas further west with a fish that was enormously popular in the Gilded Age. A catch of 16.5 million pounds in 1899, however, plummeted to just 210,000 pounds in 1921. A number of factors probably contributed to the decline, including overfishing and changes in precipitation, but the primary blame rested with Philadelphia's burgeoning population and the enormous amount of waste in water it flushed into the Delaware. Water use in the city skyrocketed, increasing from 58 million gallons per day in 1880 to an astounding 319 million 30 years later. All that water, of course, once used, had to go somewhere. The sewage entering the river was so foul-smelling that the early 20th century sailors were known to jump ship rather than spend the night breathing in the nauseous fumes. By the decade of the 1910s, dissolved oxygen in the river near Philadelphia registered just 2 to 0 parts per million, with shad requiring at least 5 parts per million to survive. The fish headed upstream to spawning grounds, suffocated, and died. Two other examples of harmful effects of sewage on aquatic life, such as oyster contamination in San Francisco Bay, Newark Bay, or Staten Island Sound. But the point is that installing sewers, although hailed as a victory for public health, although it had some sorry ecological consequences. Human waste was discharged into lakes and streams, at times polluting the water supplies of towns downstream. Instead of having social value in maintaining a region's agroecology, it became just plain shit. By the turn of the century, city dwellers knew little about where their food came from, and perhaps even less about where their bodily waste went, as sewers helped to obscure from view the very ecological impact of biological necessity. The garbage problem. In the period before the 1870s, urbanites took it upon themselves to dispose of their own garbage. Some people just left it outside for pigs to devour. Others gave it to quote-unquote swill children, who collected it in carts and sold it to farmers to use as fertilizer or hog feed. It would be wrong to romanticize this system of waste removal. In Milwaukee, one account from the 1870s describes the little garbage gatherers leaving alleys reeking with filth, smelling to heaven. But this approach did not have the virtue of giving social value to garbage, recycling it for human good, as well as providing a much-needed source of income for working families struggling to survive in the city's Dickensian economy. Whatever the virtues of this ad hoc approach to disposal, it broke down in the face of the mountain garbage horses. In 1880, New York City carted away some 15,000 of them with an average weight of 1,300 pounds each. In 1912, when cars began to dominate the city, Chicago still had to send scavengers out to take care of 10,000 horse carcasses. Surveys conducted between 1903 and 1918 showed that a single city dweller produced a half a ton of refuse each year. Ashes from the burning of wood and coal remained the single largest refuse item, at least in the colder climates of the Midwest and North. In the South, The warmer weather and longer growing season meant more organic waste, which had to be taken care of quickly before it rotted. Watermelon rinds made up 20% of Savannah, Georgia's summer garbage in 1915, but with the nation's organic waste, which had to be taken care of quickly before it rotted. Watermelon rinds made up 20% of Savannah, Georgia's summer garbage in 1915, but with the nation's economy becoming increasingly organized around consumer spending, generating a vast array of new packaged items, the amount of garbage increased dramatically. Between 1903 and 1907, trash collected in Cincinnati rose from 21,600 to 31,255 tons, an increase of nearly a third, a trend apparent in most U.S. cities. In the 1880s, along came the sanitary reforms to tackle the stinking piles of refuse. Women especially championed the cause. In New York, 15 women from the wealthy Beekman Hill area, incensed by the dirt and dust that soiled clothing and ruined homes, complained to the city board of health about a pile of manure they claimed was roughly 25 feet in height. The owner of the pile, Martin Kane, employed approximately 100 men to remove manure from stables that held on the order of 12,000 to 13,000 horses, selling the dung as fertilizer to nearby farmers, often stockpiling it until prices rose to his satisfaction. Kane was eventually ordered to remove the nuisance, but he was later allowed to reopen his operation as long as he promised to keep the pile of horse droppings at a minimum. Freed by servants from many of the chores associated with taking care of their homes, middle-class women took to the streets to join the municipal housekeeping movement. In 1884, the women banded together to form the Ladies' Health Protective Association, the Women's Civic Association in Louisville, and the Neighborhood Union in Atlanta, a group of African American women who prevailed on the city to provide black residents with trash collection. Entering the traditionally male domain of civic life, women activists led by the legendary Jane Addams and other progressive reformers succeeded in expanding their public authority, but ultimately had only limited access in improving sanitary conditions. Municipal garbage collection, of course, put the Swill children out of work, although it took some time. In Milwaukee, aldermen let each ward decide whether it wanted contractors hired by the city to pick up the trash. But the new service failed when residents, still loyal to Swill children, refused to turn over their garbage. Quote, most of the garbage was removed by boys and girls and women. But the new service failed when residents, still loyal to Swill children, refused to turn over their garbage. Quote, most of the garbage was removed by boys and girls and women, mostly of Polish nationality, who used the material collected to feed hogs, unquote, a health department report noted. In 1878, a new health commissioner finally convinced officials to establish one garbage contract for the entire city. New restrictions on both children and pigs accompanied the contract. As one working-class newspaper put it, it is a great pity if our stomachs must suffer to save the noses of the rich. Once collected, where did city garbage go? In part, it depended on the kind of garbage a place produced. Incinerators, a technology invented by the British, proved popular in the southern states, where the warm piles and then was generally dumped on the land or at sea. The city of New York was notorious for dumping garbage into the Atlantic Ocean. Some 760,000 cubic yards of refuse in 1896 alone. Chicago unloaded its refuse in Lake Michigan. St. Louis and New Orleans both turned to the Mississippi River. In 1886, New York's garbage scows pitched 80% of the city's 1.3 million cartloads of refuse into the sea. From there, it drifted south to New Jersey, where swimmers commonly encountered it. as old mattresses and shoes bobbing along the waves. Smaller cities often sold their garbage as hog feed or set up pig farms. The quantity of refuse in large cities prevented them from doing the same because it would have required costly additional collections to keep refuse from rotting. City-owned piggeries flourished, especially in New England, where temperatures cooperated in keeping the garbage edible. In the early 20th century, 61 cities and towns in Massachusetts operated some kind of swine feeding program. Grand Rapids, St. Paul, Denver, and Los Angeles also used pigs as garbage disposals. During World War I, the U.S. government, anxious to conserve food, encouraged most cities to feed their refuse to hogs. The practice, however, called for very careful separation of the edible organic matter from the glass and other items hazardous to such creatures. Quote, surely very few phonograph needles would find their way into the garbage pail, unquote. One government report opined, quote, if the house to the garbage pail, unquote. One government report opined, quote, if the householders could imagine the torture suffered by the unfortunate animals, unquote. Feeding refuse to pigs, which could be slaughtered and turned into pork, gave garbage a role in the food cycle. Still, by the turn of the century, the vast majority of urban refuse was either buried, dumped at sea, or burned, in short, wasted. Before the rise of a consumption-oriented economy in the late 19th century, Americans as a whole generated little in the way of trash. Swill children savage scattered pieces of food, which their mothers incorporated into meals, and sold metal, bones, and bottles to junk dealers. Ragmen scoured city for old clothes for making paper. Women fed leftover food, living in bolstering living standards. Then, municipal trash collectors eliminated the swill children. The invention of wood pulp did away with the need for ragmen. The recycling networks that had arisen earlier, despite a social system dedicated to clean homes and societies, superseded them. Ironically, the move simply shifted waste outside the immediate food and soil cycles to downstream and downwind regions where it did far more harm. Conclusion. The Great Cleanup, which spelled death for the organic city, had many virtues: a decline in diseases, especially waterborne ones like typhoid fever, and an improved and more aesthetically pleasing urban environment, plus no more pigs to contend with on the streets. But tidying up the metropolis meant compromising, plus no more pigs to contend with on the streets. But tidying up the metropolis meant compromising life in other quarters. A whiter and brighter life came at the cost of fish kills, algae blooms, and garbage-strewn beaches. The cleansing compulsion also hurt the poor, who once put filth to work in the service of the family economy. Meanwhile, the rise of mass production and distribution, packaged foods, thick newspapers, products planned on purpose to become obsolete, made it even more difficult for Americans to keep pace with what its citizens no longer wanted.